evening we're going to talk about how Japan sees China. I suppose we ought to do another one about how China sees Japan, but maybe that's one for next year, is it, Nana? And our main speaker tonight is Dr. Taku Tamaki, here on my left as you look at us. And Dr. Tamaki is a lecturer in international relations at Loughborough University, where he's been since 2007. And he specializes in the international political dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region. And he's also spent time at International Christian University in Tokyo, so he seems to be one of those people who goes backwards and forwards between Japan and the UK. I note in his CV here, he also spent 4 years as a US Treasuries broker at Cantor Fitzgerald in Tokyo. I was actually in Tokyo in the financial markets at that time as well in 1995 when Barings Bank collapsed. Yeah, God, it seems a long time ago now. Anyway, so that's Dr. Taku Tamaki, and our moderator this evening is Dr. Giulio Pugliese, who is a lecturer in war studies at King's College London's fabled War Studies Department. And he specialises in politics in the Asia-Pacific, so very much kind of overlapping interests. He has spent time at various places around the world, including being an assistant professor at Heidelberg University's Institute of Chinese Studies. And he's also worked for 4 years in Japan in a variety of roles. He's a member of the editorial board of Asia Major, which is probably pronounced completely differently because it's an Italian. How are you going to pronounce it then?
Yeah, Asia Major.
Asia Major, okay, which is the leading academic publication on current affairs in Asia in Italy, if you see what I mean. And he is also the co-author of a book, Sino-Japanese Power Politics, Might, Money and Mines. So both very much Asian relations specialists. And on that, I think I'm going to turn it over. Is Dr. Tamaki going to start, right? Or are you going to say something first?
Perhaps I'll introduce Dr. Tamaki's research, and should I move to
Please,
the...
yeah.
It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Tamaki Taku, who has a strong background on international relations theory. Tamaki Taku is, Dr. Tamaki is a theorist and has studied for both his master's and PhD program at Aberystwyth University, where essentially international relations theory was born. And I think that today's talk is going to be particularly fundative because it builds up on Dr. Tamaki's background, which has always tried to understand Japan's relationship with its neighbors, its love-hate relationship with its neighbors, by looking at discourses and narratives within Japan, especially official discourses, to pinpoint at Japan's identity vis-a-vis its neighbors, and so how Japan constructs its own foreign policy identity, but also its own state identity in relationship to South Korea, and in this case, as you will see, China. And today's talk is particularly important, not just because of the implications on how Japanese identity and its own understanding of itself, at least within the foreign policy-making elite, is changing vis-a-vis a fastly rising China. But it's also fascinating because it's on a topical subject, and it uses a very novel approach, which goes beyond traditional Western theories of international relations. It goes beyond Western theories of international relations and tries to use and adapt, really, a philosophy that was built up in the 1920s and 30s by one of the disciples of Nishida Kitaro, Watsuji Tetsurō, one of the members of the so-called Kyoto School. And I think this is very welcome contribution. It will be a very welcome contribution to the literature, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate, because we are going to enter uncharted waters, not just in terms of the open question of what is going to be Japan's relationship with China, which is still an open-ended question, but also uncharted waters in terms of how is it that we're going to understand international relations beyond our own social constructs, beyond our own Western approaches, by using original insights from Japanese philosophy. And I guess I'm done blabbing, and without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tamaki Taku. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's a privilege for me to be able to stand here and give a talk on Daiwa Foundation, because I've benefited very much from the funding by Daiwa Foundation. I've been looking at Japan's relationship with the United Kingdom more in terms of the Brexit context, as well as another project that I've been developing, and I've benefited from the funding by the Daiwa Foundation. It's a real privilege for me to be able to give a talk here. And as Giulio said, as Dr. Pugliese said, this is very much a sort of a theoretical exercise, although I hope it doesn't have to be too abstract. So this is very much a paper in progress, as well as, dare I say, an experiment in trying to sort of frame Japan's reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative within an admittedly eclectic theoretical context. So I welcome any comments, suggestions, and criticisms you might have. The main concern in my paper is very simply, what does BRI mean for Japan? However, my aim here is not so much to provide a sort of a policy implications of the Japanese government having to live with BRI. Rather, I want to sort of explore the macro-social, if we could call it that, and the spatial meanings that BRI might have for the Japanese government. Another way of putting this is that in this paper, what I want to do is to explore whether the ideas of a non-Western, and in my case, a very particular Japanese thinker, can shed a new-ish light on the ideational implications or meanings of BRI on the Japanese government. And as someone trained as an international relations theorist and interested in what Asia as an international environment means for Japan, I want to sort of bring in the ideas of Watsuji Tetsurō. Watsuji was at the periphery of Kyoto School philosophy, influenced by philosophers, as Dr. Pugliese said, Nishida Kitaro, as well as German philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, who was his contemporary in the 1920s and the 30s. Watsuji's main concern has been with ethics, but Watsuji's he reinterpreted ethics to mean questions of human existence, what he called the ningen no gaku toshite no rinrigaku. And what is striking about his ideas, I think, is twofold. First, his concern with the way humans interact with one another through language and meanings, which have clear resonance with much of social theoretical thinking today. And his ideas sort of predate the thinking inherent in contemporary social theory, and I think there is much to learn from Watsuji himself. Second is that his ideas about self-other dichotomy, the very basic notion of social identity, is an interesting theoretical tool to use in exploring what Belt and Road Initiative means for Japan. His ideas involve not just the subject-subject relationships, which is at the core of Western social theoretical thinking, but his ideas also include an element of environment-subject dimension. And I think his ideas are useful because not only are we looking at Japan's relationship with other international actors, hence the subject-subject interaction, but also we're looking at the recalibration of its spatial existence from the Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, which inheres an element of environment-subject relationship. And I think Watsuji calls this complex interrelationship involving subject-subject relationship as well as the environment-subject dimension as aidagara, which roughly translates to relationship, but also takes into consideration how agents are impacted by other agents as well as the surrounding environment. So my theoretical take on what BRI means for the Japanese government is this, that BRI, with its subject-subject relationship involving Japan's interaction with China, obviously, but the United States as well, and other states, ASEAN member states, and Australia or India, which I won't go too much into in this paper. But there's that subject-subject dimension, as well as the environment-subject relationship, in which the Japanese government realizes that BRI is effectively the only talk of the town. And the associated expansion of Japan's spatial existence from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific seems to suggest, at least to me, that BRI represents Japan's contemporary aidagara, basically the complex interplay of actor-to-actor relationship, as well as how Japan as an actor, a state actor, sees the international environment. So my talk today is divided into 4 parts. The first part very briefly outlines an overview of BRI and its implications, analyzing what Chinese intentions might be and how the Japanese government has been responding to it. Basically, sort of a very brief overview of the literature up until now. The second part introduces Watsuji's philosophy, highlighting his main idea, aidagara, as a theoretical tool for understanding the complex interrelationships that govern human and, by implication, international existence. The third part explores Japan's government narratives to gauge how the Japanese policy establishment have been reacting to BRI, both in terms of subject-subject interaction between Japan and other governments, as well as in terms of environment-subject relationship, particularly through the narrative of free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. And finally, in part 4, I very briefly argue that Watsuji's aidagara is best equipped to provide us with an understanding of BRI as representing Japan's complex interrelationships. In short, I argue that BRI represents Japan's aidagara with the international environment. So, what I want to sort of outline here is the existing literature and its implications of China's BRI, as well as the analysis of what BRI means for Japan. I think we all know the background to BRI, but to sort of provide a very brief summary, BRI first emerged as 2 discrete ideas. Chinese President Xi Jinping announcing the Silk Road economic belt in September 2013, covering the overland component, while the Maritime Silk Road was announced the following month in October 2013. The two seem to have merged around 2015 to sort of constitute One Belt, One Road initiative, which was later sort of recast into BRI. And now there are numerous literature looking at what BRI means and does, what China is trying to achieve through BRI, as well as whether BRI is, as the Chinese like to portray, an infrastructure investment, or whether there are other political and strategic dimensions. And these include the idea that China hopes that BRI will project China as a guardian of the liberal economic order by emphasizing freer trade and higher environmental standards embedded in the Paris Climate Deal. Or that China considers BRI to be its soft power projection, helping to highlight the global significance of the China dream, pointing out that BRI is partly a reaction to President Obama's pivot back to the Asia-Pacific, making it more geo-economic than geopolitical. Another idea that is in the existing literature so far is that BRI is China's response to Obama administration's pivot, while really recognizing that BRI would help open up prominent new markets across Eurasia, providing much-needed breathing space for Chinese state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Yet there is also a possible political element in which, as pointed out by General Li Yaju of the People's Liberation Army Navy, it says the westward advance is a historical necessity for the Chinese nation, and it is also our destiny to counter U.S. encirclement of China. So there might actually be a political dimension to BRI as well. And from the Japanese perspective, the literature points to skepticism and perhaps anxiety. For instance, 2 years before President Xi Jinping's Silk Road announcements, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs 2011 diplomatic blue book was already explicit in Japanese government's concern over the non-transparency of China's military buildup, for instance. And since the downward spiral of mutual invectives and deteriorating relationships following the nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands by the Japanese government in the summer of 2012, the July 2013 issue of the Defense White Paper was explicit about the Chinese threat, reflecting Japanese concerns over purported Chinese coercion and the threat or use of force. The National Defense Program guidelines also identified China as a grave threat to our safety, as it said. So on the one hand, there is this element of China threat, which has been sort of, as an idea at least, has been going on, sort of before the BRI was announced itself. And the Japanese ambivalence over BRI also entails Japan's spatial recalibration, as it were. The realities of BRI set in, the imperatives of foreign direct investment, China almost competing, as it were, with Japan in terms of its unique selling point, i.e. ODA and foreign infrastructure investment. So there is this reality of BRI, which also entails Japan's spatial recalibration, as it were, of its sphere of interest, reflecting a sense that a new reality for Japan is emerging because of BRI. And this is where I think FOIP might come in. FOIP was first enunciated by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in August 2016 when he mentioned the confluence of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and of Asia and Africa into a place that values freedom, the rule of law, and the market economy free from force or coercion and making it prosperous. And one idea considers FOIP as an attempt at enhancing connectivity between Asia and Africa by proactively contributing to realizing peace and stability in the international community. So that's one of the ideas that is going on within the existing literature, pretty much sort of paralleling or almost sort of like a mirror image of China's BRI or the ideas about China's BRI. Yet Japan's gaze on the Indian Ocean is nothing new per se. It dates back from February 2013 speech by Prime Minister Abe when he outlined a vision of when the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region gets more and more prosperous. So FOIP itself is not necessarily a response to BRI, although BRI and the reality of it might have exacerbated the poignancy of what might be meant by FOIP. So in terms of timing, FOIP overlaps with the US pivot and the BRI. However, there is also a literature that warns us that seeing the FOIP strategy as a direct response to the BRI is incorrect. And this literature notes that Japanese officials emphasize that Japan is interested in quality growth and quality infrastructure. It's the kind of sort of key phrase that we'll see quite often as you go into the FOIP and the language of FOIP. While there are also suggestions that FOIP's political dimensions cannot be denied, as FOIP encapsulates twin goals of creating a new growth regime engine to revitalize the Japanese economy and strengthening the strategic links with Asian countries to balance China's regional influence. So in a way, the kind of the literature that we have today about FOIP, about Japan's response to BRI almost parallels or very much sort of resonates with the ideas or the existing literature on BRI. So moving to the environment-subject relationship and what Watsuji Tetsurō as a philosopher might be able to tell us, at least from a more conceptual level, is this. Now what we see from the existing literature is then a debate as to the implications of BRI to Japan, both positive and negative. That seems to be at the core of the existing literature and existing ideas about BRI and what it means for Japan. But the literature also reveals in a very subtle way the existence of a complex web of interrelationships surrounding Japan. And as a sort of a theorist, this is the kind of thing that I sort of cling on to as I go through the literature on BRI, Japan's response to it, and FOIP, and so forth and so on. And what do I mean by this? Well, this complex web that I'm beginning to see in terms of the current literature And indeed, the sort of the subtle ideas that sort of is underneath it is this. Well, on the one hand, there's the subject-subject relationship, in which Japan is reacting to the behavior of actors, in particular China and the United States. If you take FOIP, not so much as a response to, but sort of emphasized through BRI, is effectively in response to China's behaviors, or if this language of Indo-Pacific is in response to Obama's pivot back when Hillary Clinton mentioned Indo-Pacific in 2012, and if this sort of the language that seems to have taken on a life of its own, even within the Japanese foreign policy discourse, we are seeing an element of subject dimension. At the same time, I also see the environment-subject relationship, in which Japan reacts to both the changing international environment, in which BRI becomes the only talk of the town, right? As well as the expanded existential space for Japan, the Indo-Pacific. And when we consider both the subject-subject interaction as well as the environment-subject dimension, bringing in Japanese thinkers such as Watsuji, I think becomes quite useful in pondering what BRI means for Japan, and this is where my experiment, as it were, lies. Watsuji's idea is that human existence is a dialectic involving individual agency as well as constraints of society. But he also adds that such a process of emergence and elaboration, basically the way the social norms and ideas and social structures begin to take on lives of their own, is itself a historical process particular to the milieu, or what he calls Fudo. For Watsuji, the complex relationship between and amongst the subjects and the environment constitutes an aidagara, an interrelationship that defines human existence. And here Watsuji considers the subject-subject relations to constitute a dual structure, what he calls nijusei, in which the subjects are deemed individuals while simultaneously as part of a larger society. Meaning that while subjects are interacting with one another, they are also interacting with society. And I think Watsuji's ideas are striking in that they resonate with contemporary social theory. If you're familiar with social theoretical backgrounds, you'll be surprised how the kind of things Watsuji is saying with respect to ethics resonates very much with the social theoretical thinking. Watsuji defines human existence through a complex interrelationship involving multiple layers of interrelationships. This entails first a subject-subject relationship, defining the manner in which individuals interact to produce an idea of self versus the other, which is sort of applicable to Japan's relationship with China or Japan's relationship with the United States, so forth and so on. Then there's a second element of subject-subject relationship, sort of it's at a different level, i.e. subject-society relationship, enabling individuals to interact with one another while interacting with a social structure in a process reminiscent of the contemporary social theoretical thinking. So if you're familiar with the social theory, it's almost like saying, well, there's an agent culture problem inherent in human experience. And a complex relationship between an actor and the social environment. Again, if you want to treat Japan's relationship with China, with the United States as actor-actor relationship, you might also want to sort of see how Japan or the Japanese government is reacting to the changing international environment, partly as an element of actor-society relationship. But finally, once you move from actor-actor relationship to actor-society dynamics, then that also leads us to human existence comprising these complex webs of interrelations recurring through time, and how actors and environment interact, and how environment changes through interrelationships between and amongst actors, but also the case where the international environment is acting on, or indeed provoking, as it were, actors to change ideas and indeed change the language. Now, staying on Watsuji for a moment, for Watsuji, such a complex interrelationship in time and space constitutes the aidagara, the interrelationship. Aidagara is about how subjects relate to other subjects, but it is also about how subjects cope with the challenges imposed by the environment. Yet the role of the environment lies not so much in a deterministic manner, prescribing the way subjects interact with other actors within a social context, but more as an integral factor in how humans reproduce identities and understandings about the particularities of the space within which they thrive. So, how then do we apply Watsuji's ideas to Japan's reaction to BRI? I mean, after all, Watsuji was a Kyoto school, well, on the periphery of Kyoto school of philosophy, and as I said, he speaks much to contemporary social theory. Now, how on earth do I go about applying that framework to Japan's reaction to BRI, or to put differently, what can Watsuji tell us about BRI? In a way, BRI exhibits a subject-subject relationship, as I've been saying, as the Japanese government remains anxious about China's intentions, particularly given the deterioration in diplomatic relations since the skirmishes in East China Sea, 2010-ish, and then, of course, the 2012 nationalization. Simultaneously, though, BRI provides an impetus for the Japanese government to recalibrate Japan's position within the international environment. Hence, BRI exhibits an element of coexistence of both the subject-subject as well as environment-subject dimension, meaning that it has an aidagara quality for Japan's international existence. The Ministry of Finance, MOF, and Aso Taro, the finance minister in particular, seem unconvinced of an aspect of BRI. So this is sort of the subject-subject dimension right now. Officially, MOF and Finance Minister Aso are very concerned, skeptical about one aspect of BRI, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, of course, officially AIIB is not part of BRI, but there is a sense that what matters is less whether AIIB part of BRI or not the precision of the relationship, as it is more to do with the general anxiety that the Japanese government seems to be experiencing with China's purported intentions. In April 2015, Finance Minister Aso admitted that the demand for infrastructure investment in developing countries of Asia is nothing new, questioning whether AIIB has the capacity to review the viability of infrastructure projects. Similarly, in May 2015, Finance Minister Aso reiterated Asia's appetite for infrastructure investment, so the demand is there, emphasizing Japanese campaign to boost high-quality infrastructure partnership, and in the process suggested that as long as AIIB is a responsible lender, then the Asian Development Bank nor World Bank should worry. But there is an undercurrent there. Yet he also emphasized that ADB's advantages lie in its experience, noting that what we do not want is for AIIB to lend money on top of other international financial institutions or IFIs, only for the borrowers to renege on the AIIB debt, then ask other IFIs to chip in, since that would be very inconvenient. Milk is what he said. So we can see that MOF remained very skeptical of China's project, revealing one dimension of what BRI means for Japan, that BRI and the larger Chinese foreign investment drive is something to be worried about. Indeed, we can sense that MOF considered BRI to be a serious challenge to Japan's unique selling point, as it were. Yet there has also been a countervailing pragmatism within the Japanese government, accepting that the BRI is now the only talk of the town. Prime Minister Abe Shinzo stated in November 2015 that Japan and China are inextricably interlinked, and that China's peaceful development is not only an opportunity, chance for Japan, but indispensable for international economic growth. Japan will not hesitate to cooperate. And in referring to BRI, Foreign Minister Kishida Fumio at that time stated in May 2017 that Central Asia is an important region from the perspective of geopolitics, as well as global problems such as energy security, terrorism, and drug policy, adding that Central Asia and Japan dialogue is for security and stability, not in response to an event in a particular third country, referring to the BRI Forum. A similar sentiment was expressed by the Secretary General of the Liberal Democratic Party, Nikai Toshihiro, in May 2017, when he suggested that, with respect to AIIB, the issue for Japan is how early we join the AIIB. He added that, from the political perspective, it is important we do not delay, while pointing out that Japan remains concerned about AIIB, AIIB's official governance structure, and that once these questions have been addressed, then Japan will consider positively, 前向きに. So another Japanese story of BRI, told by perhaps the Prime Minister, the MOFA, and parts of the LDP leadership, is that BRI is a potential concern, but at the same time, it is a reality that needs to be embraced. Now, of course, skepticism towards Chinese intentions persists within the Japanese government. But there's also a realization that BRI needs to be embraced within the framework of FOIP. It is here that an environment-subject interrelationship can also be witnessed, as the Japanese government is slowly adjusting to the changed international context, adjusting FOIP to be less antagonistic and more complementary to BRI. The then Foreign Minister Kono Taro stated in January 2018 that Sino-Japanese relations are not just about how Japan and China should improve relations, but it is important that Japan and China cooperate to responsibly solve problems of global scale. He noted that we told the Chinese that we are concerned about the openness of the infrastructure, transparency, the economic viability of each infrastructure project, or the financial health of borrowers, and that we will cooperate where possible. The Japanese position now seems to embrace BRI in the pursuit of FOIP. In April 2018, the then Foreign Minister Kono pointed out that FOIP and BRI are compatible, stating that as far as Japan is concerned, we can see us cooperating with projects compatible with international standards and on a case-by-case basis. Having talked with the Chinese with regards to prospects for cooperation in third countries, we told the Chinese that FOIP will benefit BRI. So there is an element of Japan not quite embracing BRI, but understanding that BRI as a reality needs to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. So the Japanese government now seems more amenable towards BRI. Prime Minister Abe told President Xi that we hope that BRI would adopt international standards such as openness and transparency, acknowledging that FOIP can only be pursued by embracing BRI. The Japanese government remains skeptical of Chinese intentions, but it reluctantly admits that China's political economic influence is now an inescapable reality. And it is telling that the Japanese government responded to Southeast Asian criticisms that FOIP strategy sounds antagonistic towards BRI, with Southeast Asian governments fearing that signing up to FOIP, so long as it became a FOIP strategy, would alienate China. The Japanese government responded in November 2018, adopting the word vision instead of strategy to allay Southeast Asian concerns. So the Japanese government's view of BRI is less an outright hostility as it is one of skepticism towards China's intentions. There's also a concern within Japan that BRI is more than an infrastructure investment, that it is China's tool for expanding its political and strategic influence. Yet there seems to be a countervailing notion as well within the Japanese government that BRI is the only talk of the town, and that only by co-opting BRI will Japan be able to pursue FOIP. This admixture, as it were, of reaction to BRI shows the complexity of interrelationships involving subject-subject interrelationship between Japan and China, as well as other governments, as well as the environment-subject relationship involving the evolving international political environment, which prompted the Japanese government to embrace BRI, albeit reluctantly. However, there's another dimension to the environment-subject relationship in Japan's response to BRI, the recalibrated physical space, as exemplified through the language of FOIP. Here, the recurring reference to FOIP within Japanese reaction to BRI reflects changing international circumstances surrounding Japan. The US pivot to Asia and the expansion of China's BRI accelerated the enlargement of Japanese sphere of interest, as it were, if you want to call it that, from the Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. Here, FOIP represents an environment-subject interrelationship in which the Japanese government is compelled to enhance its influence beyond the Asia-Pacific. Put differently, FOIP has a physical dimension, resulting in the widening of Japan's existential space. Morpha suggests that the concept of FOIP evolved from Prime Minister Abe's speech back in 2007, even predating 2013, referring to the confluence of two oceans between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and how free and open Indian Ocean is important for Japan. Morpha claims that FOIP as a language, as a more of a concrete concept, materialized in August 2016 when the Japanese government outlined how the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific region is an international public good, kokusai kokyōzai. The narratives from 2017 seem to center on economic dimensions of FOIP, particularly as its relationship with BRI increasingly became the focus of discussion. Foreign Minister Kono stated in November 2017 that FOIP is mainly an economic message to reaffirm the importance of free trade within the Asia-Pacific, denying that FOIP is designed to counter BRI, adding that it is not at all about China, but rather it is about how the US, Japan, and India answer enormous appetite for infrastructure demand. And he also pointed out that BRI has merits and that we are asking China to cooperate with FOIP. Similarly, Prime Minister Abe also stated in December 2017 that I have asked President Xi and Premier Lee that Japan is willing to cooperate in third countries, Daisangoku, and that under FOIP we are able to cooperate with China's BRI. So there seems to be a realization within the Japanese government that BRI is the only talk of the town. And FOIP was considered the template upon which Japan will cooperate with China. Foreign Minister Kono told Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in April 2018 that it is conceivable Japan will cooperate with BRI on a case-by-case basis, but stressed that FOIP remains the main tool for nurturing stability and growth in Asia and Africa. Now, to be sure, the idea that China remained a potential threat persisted. As Takizaki Shigeki of MOFA Asia Pacific Bureau states, the reality is that China is trying to change the status quo in South China Sea. He argued that FOIP is a comprehensive principle as it's not targeted at a particular country. So long as countries can agree, we are calling on everyone. No one wants FOIP to rival BRI. However, he also added that, but this does not mean Japan will cooperate with BRI. The requirement for public economic cooperation, Minkan Keizai Kyoryoku, is one of the projects are compatible with international standards. So, just as Watsuji shows, and here I'm trying to sort of experimentally link BRI with aidagara and Watsuji's ideas, is that human existence, as Watsuji told us, is comprised of multiple layers of interrelationships, or aidagara, in which Japan's behavior in response to BRI exposes the multiple interweaving layers of relationships that constitute Japan's social and physical environment. At one level, there is the subject-subject interrelationship, in which Japan encounters behaviors of individual state actors, including the Obama administration's pivot back to the Asia-Pacific, or indeed China's Silk Road initiatives, as well as in the way Japanese government feels compelled to interact with India and Southeast Asian governments, not to mention Australia, as they respond to the pivot and BRI. At another level, there is a subject-subject relationship involving a collective entity. An excellent example of this is the collective unease felt by ASEAN, mainly the Southeast Asian governments, prompting Tokyo to change the nomenclature from FOIP strategy to vision. This was an example, in my view, of Japanese government realizing a collective resistance among the Southeast Asian states to be drawn into the Sino-Japanese rivalry. Another element of this subject-subject interrelationship is the sense of peer pressure that the Japanese government seems to be experiencing as more international actors begin to subscribe to BRI and the AIIB. What we have seen through the years is a recalibration of Tokyo's language in gradually accommodating AIIB and BRI, representing the complex realities of the international environment surrounding Japan, as well as the mixture of opportunities and anxieties felt by the Japanese government. And this leads to the third level, the environment-subject interrelationship. The renaming of the geographical extent from the Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific indicates, to me at least, the social dynamics have prompted redefinition of Japan's existential space. However much you might think of Japan subscribing to Indo-Pacific as very much a lip service to the US government. So in lieu of conclusions, we can say that FOIP is the means through which Japan rationalizes and objectivizes, or as Watsuji himself would say, kkakkanka, the international challenges in the era of China's rise, and FOIP provides the language through which the complex international aidagara with numerous other international actors and the overall international environment within which Japan finds itself In short, FOIP is an ideational tool for the Japanese government to make sense of the changing international circumstances surrounding Japan. China's rise and its increased influence, particularly through BRI, has prompted a transformation in Japan's spatial reality. Put another way, Japan does have experience with infrastructure projects via ODA and many other regions covered by BRI, so it's nothing new per se, but much of the international attention by the policy circles and the media center on BRI to the effect that BRI has effectively become the only talk of the town, rightly or wrongly. And this is happening within the international political backdrop of the US pivot under the previous Obama administration, not to mention the uncertainties over the international role of the US under the Trump administration as well as the BRI. And this prompts Japan to react, if not compelled to address this international development. As such, BRI represents the complex nature and reality of challenges to the international environment and Japan's relationships with other actors in the Asia-Pacific. And such changes brought about a rethink of Japan's existential space, prompting the change in the language from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. Of course, until there are further changes in the international power structure, FOIP as a new geographical reality for Japan, I think, will likely remain. And the reality of BRI will determine the aidagara within which Japan finds itself. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And what I admire about your paper has been is the ambition. I think it is a topical matter, but it's also very ambitious in terms of new avenues of research. And it would be extremely important in terms also of how we understand the world from different perspectives, but could go away and move away from our own Eurocentric perspectives. I think what would be interesting to stay with the philosophy of Watsuji is to understand how applicable, first and foremost, is Watsuji's philosophy to keep on your own ground. How applicable would a philosophy of ethics to international relations be? And I say so because, of course, we're talking about complex machines, and those are states, right? But are even further more complex than single individuals. And so to anthropomorphize a state then becomes complicated, in my opinion, precisely because they're not defined. They're not defined, to give an example, in terms of their leaderships. We live in a era of fluidity where perhaps that fluidity gives a lot of space to leadership, and charismatic leadership in particular, in terms of impacting on the international environment, precisely because the international environment is much more fluid. And so, for instance, a Prime Minister Abe perhaps would act differently from a Hatoyama, to give an example, right? So, how is it possible to anthropomorphize a state and then use that concept of a sort of like faceless Japan within that environment as an analytical tool? I'm not entirely confident of how to solve that problem myself. And the other thing is specific to Watsuji's philosophy, and correct me if I'm mistaken. My impression was that Fudo, the milieu, I don't know how to better define it, and climate, but really it's a milieu. Fudo was exogenous to Watsuji's philosophy, as far as I understand, to the extent that he ventured a lot into what goes by the name, I would say, of Nihon Jinron arguments of like Japan's uniqueness, and of cultural, really geocultural, if you want, unique traits of different portions of the world. And why is that? Because he did, in my understanding, he did give attention to time with changing, and there was a sort of like relational dynamic between the environment or milieu and the subject, but he also gave a lot of importance to space, to the extent that he would make geocultural arguments where the monsoon culture, the monsoon sort of climate or milieu, would define a specific type of culture, in a sense, right? Of course, it was different case by case, and he argued that Japan's monsoon culture was particularly different, right, and particularly unique. And so, if that is the case, if the so-called environment or milieu is exogenous, can we apply this to the Belt and Road Initiative or to contemporary international politics as exogenous to Japan? In my opinion, we are still living in an age of deep fluidity, to go back to the earlier point, where the answers are very much in the making, and there is deep pluralism, in fact. So I'm not even sure. First and foremost, the BRI is the only talk of town. I agree, but the reason why it's the only talk of town, in my opinion, is because it's a global Rorschach test, and so it means so many different things depending on whom you ask to. So, for instance, to security experts, the BRI, you're aware what a Rorschach test is. The BRI is basically like murder and Chinese hegemony, which perhaps is in the back of Chinese policymakers. As a Senegal Italian, I would agree with that. At the same time, development economists would agree that the BRI is actually a good thing, for instance. And the fascinating thing about the sort of amorphous thing that BRI is that it applies also to FOIP. So many countries have embraced FOIP, even the United States, to the extent that it means it has definitions that change depending on the country that has endorsed it. So if that's the case, how can we pinpoint Japan's adaptation to BRI with FOIP if the definitions constantly change? Perhaps what we're talking about is really Chinese foreign policy and Japanese foreign policy, in a sense. And I think it's fascinating. And the fact that we have this these conversations on different developing concepts and symbols. Italy has signed up to both FOIP and BRI. We are very ecumenical. I think this speaks wonders about the fluidity of the environment. And of the deep pluralism, I guess, that perhaps feeds into something that, in my opinion, was perhaps a bit more defining Watsuji's philosophy when he talked about the environment. And then, perhaps, specific to the environment, from Japan's perspective, I suspect that Japanese policymakers do have in the back of their mind China's rise very much as the key question that Japan confronts. And it's not just perhaps intersubjective, it defines the environment as a whole. But my feeling is that, and this is not just Japan's, it's not just Japan's key question, it's the key question that we all confront also in Western Europe and elsewhere. The key question is, China's rise has potential avenues for cooperation with China, but also potential deep challenges. But on the other side, what is possibly also challenging, and it's going to feed into a lot of anxiety, is the US relative decline, and what that means. To the extent that governments have to be concerned about managing not just China's rise, but also US relative decline, and sometimes not necessarily in a positive direction, talking about the US foreign policy, as we see with this administration, some aspects of this administration. And so perhaps the environment should be defined within that particular relationship, the US-China relationship, and the dynamics that affect that relationship, rather than just focus on BRI as the only game in town. And in my understanding, the reason why FOIP is a response to China's rise is because it actually wants to pull back in the United States of America. So this is, as a concept, as you're absolutely right, originates from Japan, but in my understanding, it's a way to dilute China's influence by bringing back in the United States, trying to make sure that the US is a staying power rather than an isolationist one, and to further dilute Chinese influence by bringing back in also India and other like-minded countries. And so again, perhaps then it speaks wonders of a pluralist world that Japan is trying to respond to. And when Japan declares that it wants to cooperate with China, this is an open question, I don't know the answer. How much of that is diplomatic parlance? Chinese analysts and Chinese policymakers, when Japan would make its initial overtures of cooperation with China under specific conditions, the ones you mentioned: openness, transparency, sustainability, respect for recipient countries' needs and whatnot. Some Chinese analysts thought that this was basically the exact same thing that the US did when it extended the invitations to the Marshall Plan to the Soviet Union. But it did so under certain conditions that US policymakers, and this is like history, it's in the documents, made sure that the Soviet Union would not accept. So it was a way of sort of like, playing up, of course, diplomatic parlance, also because you want to be seen and understood as a constructive player in international politics. Or perhaps, in fact, Japan wants to shape China's rise by trying to change its government financing behavior. And so by making China abide by OECD practice and so on and so forth. I don't know the answer to that. Or perhaps, to go back to the earlier point, Japan is making these overtures because the structure, so to speak, or the environment is defined really by the US-China dynamics, and so it needs to hedge the bets. And so it needs to make sure that it doesn't give too much leverage to the Trump administration, for instance, that clearly acts sometimes on mafioso-like calculations of asking for protection money. Basically, this is like last week's news that the Trump administration, and this was probably already signaled quietly to Japanese policymakers, that the US is about to ask 4 times the price of the cost of its troops, of what the Japanese give to sustain US troops in Japanese soil. And of course, in return, they would stay there and protect Japan. So this is very dangerous territory that Japan is entering as well, and perhaps it wants to hedge its bets by stabilizing its relationship with China. And so again, maybe the environment is really defined by those 2 big players. I think there is a lot of meat, I'm not sure, what would you prefer to do? Perhaps you would like to respond, or if you want to take more comments from the audience, I guess it's very flexible.
Right. Thank you very much for that. What I'll do is, I don't think I'll be able to address everything.
Sure.
A lot of very helpful and very important points. Just to sort of summarize the first bits about how applicable Watsuji's ideas are, I think it's exactly the point that I think I need to work out more. As part of the experiment is to try to really see how a Kyoto School philosopher, well, not so much a Kyoto School philosopher as he was sort of sitting more on the periphery of Kyoto School, but his ideas might be applicable, and this idea about anthropomorphization of the state of, I don't want to go too much into the theoretical details at the point. I think it's absolutely true. We're seeing the differences in response between, say, the Prime Minister on the one hand and Morph on the other already. So we are seeing the differences. So the question is, how do we then go about talking about quote-unquote Japan? Or, in reality, do we need a much more complex model that takes into consideration domestic actors? Sort of almost atomizing them into talking about individuals' preferences, how the bureaucratic differences, how they play out in the actual policy outcomes, and how that then is responding to the larger environment. And I think that would be the more honest approach that would address some of what your criticisms are, although I must say it's going to be very complex, but of course it's something I'll need to take home and really ponder. The issue about cultural determinism, and I think, and you're absolutely right, this is something that crops up if you sort of, the more I sort of read into Watsuji, as well as some of the literature on Watsuji. Geographers hate Watsuji for exactly that reason, determination. Environmental determination, geographers hate it. But then you talk to, you look at what the philosophers are saying, say, well, yes, we know that geographers hate this cultural determinism. There is definitely that language of cultural determinism. Although then the philosophers also say, well, let's sort of filter around some of the more core ideas where he talks about the role of the environment and space, how that impact on humans, and then how that the human interaction and reaction to the environmental input or impact then changes the environment. So there's ongoing debate, and of course, what your criticism is basically touching upon that. How do I then go about making sure I am aware of that debate? And indeed, this criticism about cultural determination is, of course, a very important one for me, which I do need to provide, I suppose, a better grounding and indeed better defense of how I then can use some of the more the core ideas that speak to the contemporary social theoretical arguments about agents, the structures, or how the actors then respond and indeed can change the social environment. And I think that needs to be worked out much more. So thank you very much for that. And on the more empirical level, yes, I think there are so many different levels in which this thing is played out. And US as the environment, I think that of course needs to come out much more on this. I think the flip side of responding to China is exactly that. So on the one hand you have, as you say, being amenable towards China, being amenable towards BRI, but then also pointing out that FOIP is important. Now it's about Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific. So we're seeing a change in language. And whenever you see changes in the language or signifiers, geographical signifiers emerging or popping out in Japanese foreign policy language is pretty much in response to US demands. The Far East changing to the Asia-Pacific, basically meaning expand your security periphery to include the Korean Peninsula as well as Taiwan. Let's look at Southeast Asia and beyond, then that becomes the wider Asia-Pacific. And of course, after 9/11, you have the surrounding areas. Now go beyond the Asia-Pacific. We need you to sort of look at the situational elements of the developments in international terrorism, the surrounding areas, and perhaps FOIP as a new language lies at the another sort of end of that sort of spectrum, moving from the Far East to the Asia-Pacific and then to surrounding areas and now to FOIP. Of course, we're looking at different things. It's not focusing just about defense. There's much more in terms of political, economic dimensions, infrastructure. But again, as you pointed out, Japan has been doing this for quite some time now. So it's nothing new in terms of ODA, infrastructure developments. And China is just doing it on a more massive scale. So that's why people are noticing it. So in a sense, what Japan is doing is not new. It's just sort of repackaging the sort of existing ideas and trying to sell it in the age of BRI. And Obama's pivot back, and especially, as you say, Trump's Trump administration turning its back on the international system, as it were, if you want to call it that. And lip service, in terms of Japan being amenable to cooperation with China, most probably it is. My sort of right now, my reaction, my answer to that would be, and I fully agree with that, and I think it's something that I need to to work with, but the language is there. The language corporation is there. So it's really about saying whether it's just a lip service or we sort of ignore it, or should we take that behavior, Japan paying lip service to BRI, as something that needs more investigation. And I suppose this is something that I should have made more clear in my presentation and in my paper. And isn't FOIP or corporation BRI is just hedging? I think it is. And again, I think it's really about saying, okay, it's hedging. That's one way of looking at understanding Japan's behavior. But then, okay, what are the sort of characteristics inherent in that hedging? And I might then bring in, well, there's the language of FOIP. There's the language of causing after BRI by saying, we're happy, we would be happy with BRI if you subscribe to FOIP. But FOIP is not something that is distinct from BRI. It's something that, no, this sort of, this is ultimately hedging behavior, but what does that hedging behavior entail? And my answer would be, well, let's start looking at the language. But thank you very much for the comments. They're very helpful, and it's something that I will definitely need to take home.